In the snowy hills of Bavaria, a remote farmhouse stood eerily quiet. Smoke still curled from the chimney, the livestock had been fed, the hearth was warm from the outside. It looked like life was continuing exactly as it should. But inside that farmhouse, 6 people were dead. An entire family and their maid brutally murdered. No forced entry, no clear motive, no cries for help, only strange clues. Footprints in the snow that led to the farm, but never away from it. Sounds in the attic at night, a missing set of keys, and evidence that whoever committed the murders may have remained there for days, living among the bodies. More than a century later, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of the most chilling, unsolved crimes in Europe. A case so unsettling, so eerie, that even now it feels less like history and more like a nightmare someone never woke up from. Before this story climbs down from the attic, locks the doors from the inside, and settles in for a few more nights, make sure to follow, comment, like, and turn on notifications. Because some killers don't run, they stay. This is episode 5, The Hinterkaifeck Murders. To understand why this case still gets under people's skin more than 100 years later, you have to picture the setting first. Hinterkaifeck was not a village, not a town, not even really a neighborhood. It was a lonely farmstead in Bavaria, hidden behind the tiny village of Kaifeck, about 70 kilometers north of Munich. It sat near woods and open fields with very little around it except distance, silence, and weather. In winter, snow and cold could make it feel almost cut off from the rest of the world. Even when the roads were passable, the farm still carried the feeling of isolation. It was the kind of place where darkness came hard at night, the kind of place where a lantern in the distance would stand out, the kind of place where if something went wrong, help would not arrive quickly. In early 1922, 6 people lived there. Andreas Gruber, 63, the patriarch of the farm, his wife, Cäzilia, their widowed daughter, Viktoria Gabriel, 35, Victoria's daughter, 7 years old, Cäzilia, her little son, Josef, just 2 years old, and finally, Maria Bargardum, a 44-year-old maid who had only just arrived. On paper, it sounds simple, a rural farm family living and working in the land together, but almost nothing about the Gerber family was simple. They had a reputation, not the warm kind of reputation old farming families like to have, not hardworking, respected, admired. No, they were talked about, whispered about. People in the surrounding area found them strange, difficult, private. Some neighbors kept their distance, others gossiped. Rumors hung around the family like fog, especially around Andreas Gruber, whose temper and harsh nature were well known. And then there were darker rumors of disturbing behaviors inside the home. Rumors people repeated carefully, quietly, and usually only when they believed they were out of earshot. So even before the murders, Hinterkaifeck already felt different, already felt wrong. And then, in the weeks before the killings, the farm began to produce its own warnings. Warnings that, in hindsight, sound almost unbearable. Weeks before anyone was killed, strange things began happening at the farm. Andreas Gruber told a neighbor that he had discovered footprints in the snow. That alone was not unusual. Farms got visitors, workers, hunters, delivery men, drifters, neighboring families, but those footprints were different. They came from the forest, and they led directly to the farm. But there were no footprints leading back out. Just think about that for a second. Imagine looking out at snow-covered ground and seeing a trail of footprints approaching your home from the woods, and stop. Not circle back, not continue past, not disappear into some obvious explanation. Just arrive. Andreas reportedly searched for the source. He looked around the property. He tried to find some practical answer, but there wasn't one. Then came the newspaper. A newspaper from Munich appeared at the farm, one nobody in the household had purchased. It was as if someone unknown had been on the property, close enough to leave something behind. Around the same time, a set of house keys disappeared, vanished. No one could find them. Then the noises started. At night, the family heard footsteps in the attic. Not scratching, not scurrying, not the light sound of mice or the shifting of old wood. Footsteps. Slow movement across the floorboards overhead. The kind of sounds that makes you stop breathing for a second just to make sure you heard it right. The previous maid had already left the farms months before because she believed the place was haunted. She complained about footsteps above her room. She said she felt watched. She said something was wrong in the house. At the time, the family dismissed her fears as superstition. But as March of 1922 on, even Andreas Gruber, a stubborn, proud man not known for fearfulness, began to sense that something was off. He searched the property himself, lantern in hand, sometimes with a weapon, looking through the outbuildings, checking the yard, trying to find an intruder or an animal or an explanation that would let him return to normal life. He found nothing. Or maybe nothing he understood. Or maybe something he refused to fully accept. Because what would you rather believe? That the attic is noisy? Or that someone has been above your head listening to your family sleep? Let's slow down and walk through the farm's final days. Because this part matters. Late February of 1922, Andreas notices the footprints leading from the woods to the property with no track leading away. Around the same time, the families discovered unexpected Munich newspapers. Soon after, the attic noises begin. Early March, one of the house keys disappears. The household grows more uneasy. Viktoria reportedly tells others that she feels watched. For a remote farm family, these things would have felt disturbing enough on their own. Together, they begin to form a pattern. Something was around the farm. Someone may have been near the farm. And whoever or whatever it was, it did not seem eager to announce itself. Then came March 30th. The family finally arranged for a new maid, Maria, to come work at Hinterkaifeck. She arrived to replace the former maid who had left in fear. That same day, the older warnings still hung in the air. The former maid repeated that there was something uncanny about the place. Andreas, meanwhile, told a neighbor about the strange clues, the footprints, the noises, the failed search of the property. The neighbor encouraged him to report it. He didn't. Whether out of pride, stubbornness, distrust, embarrassment, or a simple belief that he could handle it himself, he did not go to the authorities. Then came March 31st, 1922. Maria arrived at the farm, accompanied by her sister, who helped her get settled. Her sister did not stay long. She left before evening. That matters, because she would become the last known person to see the family alive. As darkness fell, the weather turned cold and unsettled. Wind rattled the farm buildings. The animals shifted and moved in the barn. The family finished their evening routines. Dinner would have been eaten, lamps would have been lit, chores finished, rooms settled. Maybe little Cäzilia was tired from the day. Maybe baby Josef was already asleep. Maybe Maria was still unpacking. Maybe Andreas was still thinking about those footprints and trying not to show it. Then, one by one, the lights in Hinterkaifeck went out, and somewhere in or around that farm, someone was waiting. Sometime during the night of March 31st, the quiet of Hinterkaifeck was shattered. Exactly how the murders unfolded, nobody can say with complete certainty. But investigators later pieced together what they believed was the most likely sequence. The killer, or killers, appeared to have lured members of the family into the barn one by one, not all at once, not in one chaotic explosion. That detail is one of the most unnerving parts of the entire case, because it suggests control, patience, a plan. Maybe it began with the animals, a noise from the stable, a dog reacting, something just suspicious enough to make one person step outside or into the attached barn to investigate. Perhaps Andreas Gruber went first. That seems plausible. He was the head of the household. He was known to deal with the property himself. If something sounded wrong outside, he would likely have checked. So picture him, lantern in hand, stepping into the darkness of the barn. Animal breathe in the cold air, wood beams overhead. He peers into the gloom, and someone is already there, waiting. The weapon was likely a mattock, a heavy farm tool with a blade and a pick-like end. The first strike would have been sudden and devastating, hard enough to silence, hard enough to drop a grown man before he could call out. Then sometime after Andreas failed to return, someone else came looking. Maybe Viktoria, maybe Cäzilia, maybe little Silly followed because the adults were moving around and she sensed something was wrong. One by one, they entered the barn, and one by one, they were attacked. The violence was severe, not hurried, not minimal, severe. Autopsies later showed crushing head wounds, repeated blows, terrible injuries that suggest rage, force, and close physical violence. This wasn't a distant murder. This wasn't poison slipped into food. This wasn't a single stab in the dark. This was intimate brutality. Among the victims in the barn was 7-year-old Cäzilia. And what happened to her is one of the hardest details in the entire case. Evidence suggests she may have survived for some time after the initial assault. Investigators found clumps of her hair torn out of the roots, likely pulled out in agony, and shook while she lay injured in the straw near the bodies of her family. It is one thing to say she was killed. It is another to imagine her alive for even a short time in that darkness, hurt, terrified, confused, surrounded by silence and blood. After the 4 victims in the barn were down, the killer moved into the house. Maria, the new maid, was attacked in her room. Think about that detail too. She had arrived that very day, her first day on the job, her first night at the farm, and it would be her last. Then the killer went to little Josef, 2 years old, asleep in his crib. He was killed with a single crushing blow. By the time that night was over, 6 people were dead. A whole household erased in one of the most isolated, horrifying family murders in modern European history. And then the story became even stranger. If the story ended there, Hinterkaifeck would already be one of the most disturbing unsolved murders. But it didn't end there, because whoever killed that family didn't leave. You know what's weird? Most of the stories we tell on Haunted in Between happen in the space where your mind is tired, your guard is down, and things feel just a little off. Late nights, long edits, too much silence. And if you're anything like me, caffeine becomes part of that routine. Here's the thing though, most energy drinks make me feel worse. Jittery, foggy, like my brain's racing but not actually focused, which is ironic when you're trying to tell stories that require focus. That's why I switched to W. W wasn't made by some massive corporation. It was made by a gamer who got sick of the junk. Sugars, dyes, big blends that do nothing but crash you later. W cuts all that out and uses coffee fruit extract, which helps with the mental focus without the sharp spike and drop. It becomes part of my late night routine, recording, researching, edits, staying present when the stories get dark. If you want to try it for yourself, you can use my promo code HauntedInBetween for 10% off at checkout. Let's get the dub. The link's in the description. Now let's get back into the story. This is the detail that turns the case from horrific to almost unreal. Evidence showed that someone remained at the farm after the murders. The bodies were not discovered immediately, and during that gap, the property did not go completely still. Smoke continued to rise from the chimney, the animals were fed, the cows were milked, food was eaten in the house, bread was used up, meals were prepared. The kitchen showed signs that someone had been living there. Try to let that sink in. Imagine finishing a mass killing and then deciding to stay. To move through the same room where the families had eaten and slept. To feed their animals. To tend to their farm. To sit near their fire while they lay dead in the barn and house. It suggests a level of calm that is difficult to process. Not panic, not desperation, comfort. Neighbors passing the property noticed signs of life, but didn't yet understand what they were seeing. One person reportedly noticed the oven or chimney still active. Another observed the farm did not seem fully abandoned. And because Hinterkaifeck was isolated, those signs did not immediately trigger alarm. That isolation is crucial to the whole case. In a busier place, 6 missing people might have been noticed in hours. At Hinterkaifeck, silence could pass for normal. No one was constantly dropping by. No one expected to see the family every single day. Missed appearance at church or school could start concern, but not immediate panic. So while the farm outwardly still looked active, Inside, it had become something else entirely, a murder scene, a hidden tomb, a house apparently occupied by the person who had created it. There's a twisted domestic quality to that detail that makes the case unforgettable. The killer didn't just destroy the home, he used it, like he had earned it, like he belonged there, like the family had been removed rather than murdered. And that is one of the reasons people still talk about this case almost like it's haunted. Because the behavior doesn't just feel criminal, it feels wrong on a deeper level. Like something had entered the house and made itself at home. At first, the family's absence did not immediately set off alarms, but the signs started to stack up. Little Cäzilia failed to appear at school. The family missed church. Visitors came by and got no response. People noticed the animals were restless. The quiet at the farm no longer felt normal. Then, on April 4th, concern became too serious to ignore. A group of neighbors went to Hinterkaifeck to check on the family. When they arrived, the buildings were closed up. The dogs were barking, the animals sounded distressed, and no one answered. They entered the barn. What they found there shocked them. 4 bodies lay hidden beneath hay and debris. Andreas, Cäzilia, Viktoria, and little Silly. The sight was so terrible that it stayed with those men for the rest of their lives. Then, inside the house, they found Maria, and finally, little Josef in his crib. 6 dead, no survivors. No explanation waiting on the kitchen table. No obvious intruder still there, just silence. And the overwhelming realization that an entire family had been wiped out. And almost immediately, another horror became clear. The murders had not just happened. Days had passed, which meant whoever had been feeding the animals and tending the house after the killer had vanished only shortly before the bodies were found. Maybe hours before. That possibility hangs over the whole case. The killer may have been right there on the property while concern was building around the outside world. Maybe he watched people pass by. Maybe he listened for voices at the gate. Maybe he was closer to discovery than anyone realized. From the beginning, the investigation was compromised. Too many people entered the crime scene before proper detectives could secure it. Neighbors, curious locals, officials, onlookers. The barn and house were contaminated almost immediately. Items were touched, footprints were trampled, potential evidence was disturbed or lost. By the time investigators from Munich became involved, the scene already a forensic disaster. This was 1922. Even under ideal conditions, modern crime scene processing did not exist the way it does now. But Hinterkaifeck wasn't even close to ideal. Autopsies were conducted on site. The victims' injuries made clear that all suffered severe head trauma consistent with a heavy farm tool, most likely a mattock, from the property itself. And one important conclusion emerged quickly. This did not look like a simple robbery. Money and valuables were still at the farm. Important items had not been taken. If robbery played a role, it clearly wasn't the whole story. That raised the most disturbing possibility. Whoever did this may not have been there for the money at all. Or, if they were, money became secondary. This may have been personal, or obsessive, or planned around. Something more complicated than theft. Investigators also found evidence suggesting the killer may have hidden in the attic or loft area before murders. Hay appeared disturbed. There were places where someone might have been lying in wait. A hidden vantage point seemed possible. That theory fits the earlier warning signs almost too well. The footsteps in the attic, the feeling of being watched, the missing key, the unknown newspaper. If true, the murderer had not merely approached the farm on the night of the killings. He may have been inside or above the family's living space before they died, listening, studying routines, waiting for the right moment. And that is the piece of the case that still feels like a horror fiction. Not just because it is supernatural, but because it's so deeply human in the worst possible way. A real intruder, a real watcher, a real killer above their heads. Some were plausible, some were desperate, some sounded almost theatrical. But one name continued to surface more than any other. Lorenz Schlitterbauer, a neighbor, a man with close personal ties to Viktoria, someone who may have been romantically involved with her. someone many believed may have fathered little Joseph. That alone would have made him a person of interest. But people also found aspects of his behavior unsettling after the discovery. He helped find the bodies. He was deeply familiar with the property, and some thought he moved through the scene with a strange degree of comfort. Too calm, they said, too controlled, too willing to touch or move things. Now, to be fair, people react to trauma in different ways. Not everyone screams or freezes. Some people become practical. Some people become numb. So strange behavior alone doesn't prove guilt. But in a case this bizarre, every detail got magnified. Over time, many locals came to believe Lorenz knew more than he admitted. Was he driven by jealousy, by resentment, by conflict over money or family, by anger towards Viktoria, Andreas, or both? Those theories never fully went away, but there were other suspects too. Former farm workers, drifters, violent men from the area, brothers and laborers who knew the property layout and may have had reason to target the family. Some theories focused on the previous maid's warning, not as ghost stories, but as signs that suspicious men had already been moving around the farm. Others wondered whether the dog's behaviors suggested the killer was someone familiar to the animals and, by extension, perhaps familiar to the family. That detail matters more than it seems. A stranger entering a remote farmhouse with a watchdog nearby should have created chaos. But whoever committed these murders appears to have navigated the property effectively. That points to one of two things. Either the killer had extraordinary control and luck, or the killer was not a total stranger. There were also wilder theories. A dead husband returning from war, multiple killers, traveling criminals, someone connected to long-buried family scandal. Even supernatural explanations floated through local lores, less because evidence supported them, and more because the case felt too eerie, too layered, too disturbing to explain by ordinary human violence. But ordinary human violence is usually exactly what these cases come back to. A real person, a real motive. Even if we never fully know it, a real act of brutality, and that may be the hardest explanation to live with, because ghosts are easier than neighbors. The Hinterkaifeck murders endure because nearly every piece of the case seems to lodge somewhere deep in the imagination. The footprints leading in but not out, the noises in the attic, the missing keys, the maid who said the place felt haunted, the family being lured one by one into the dark, the little girl surviving a time after the attack, the killer remaining in the house, the fire still burning, the animals still fed, the illusion of life continuing after life had ended. Then, the final insult. No answer, no arrest, no confession that held, no satisfying conclusion. Just years of suspicion, rumors, reinvestigation, and decay. The farm itself was eventually demolished. That makes sense. A place like that was never going to become normal again. But tearing down the building did not erase the case. If anything, it made it more ghost-like. Today, the physical farmhouse is gone, but the story remains. A memorial marks the place. The land looks peaceful now. Fields, trees, quiet. But that contrast almost makes it worse, because it reminds you how ordinary the setting really was. This was not a castle, not a war zone, not some legendary cursed fortress. It was a farmhouse, a family home, a place where people worked, ate, slept, and raised children. And that is exactly why the case still grips people, because the horror did not need a dramatic backdrop. It happened in a place that should have been safe. In the end, Hinterkaifeck is more than an unsolved murder case. It's a study in warnings ignored, and fear explained away, and how the familiar can become terrifying when something is just slightly off for too long. A sound overhead, a key gone missing, footprints where there should not be none. Most of us like to believe we would act differently. That if we sense something wrong, we would leave, call for help, trust our instincts. But would we? Or would we do what people usually do, rationalize, delay, look for the easiest explanation, tell ourselves, it's probably nothing? That may be one of the most unsettling truths hidden inside this case. The Gruber family may have sensed danger before it arrived in full, and still life continued until it didn't. The murders were never solved. Maybe the truth is buried in lost evidence. Maybe it died with the killer. Maybe it lived for years in whispers no one could prove. But whatever happened at Hinterkaifeck, it left behind one of the most unforgettable crime scenes in history. A farmhouse, a watcher overhead, a family silenced, and a mystery that still refuses to rest. If this case got under your skin, make sure to follow, like, and subscribe, and leave a comment with your theories. Who do you think killed the family at Hinterkaifeck? Was it someone close to them, a neighbor, a worker, a man hiding in plain sight, or someone who had been watching for longer than anyone realized? Next time we leave the snowy fields of Bavaria and head to Los Angeles, 1947, a city obsessed with beauty, fame, and secrets. A young woman with Hollywood dreams is found mutilated, posed, and left behind like a message meant to be seen. Her name was Elizabeth Short, and you know her as the Black Dahlia. As always, this is Haunted in Between. And remember, you're not alone, you're in between.